Let your breathing slow now. Close your eyes and let the ordinary world recede. Tonight we are going somewhere very old, to a city that stood for more than 1,000 years, that carried the flame of an ancient civilization through centuries of siege and plague and the slow erosion of empire, and that came, on a single spring morning in the 15th century, to its final hour. We are going to Constantinople. We are going to the last night. It is the evening of May the 28th, in the year 1453. The city has been under siege for 53 days. Outside the ancient walls, the Theodosian walls, those triple lines of stone and earth and rubble that had turned back Attila the Hun and the Umayyad Caliphate and the Bulgarian Khans and every other force that had come against them across 1,000 years, outside those walls, the Ottoman army of Sultan Mehmed II waits. It is an enormous army. The estimates of contemporary sources range from 80,000 to 300,000 men, and while we can suspect the higher figures of the usual medieval exaggeration, the army is certainly vast, many times larger than the garrison defending the city. The great bronze cannon called the Basilica, which Mehmed had commissioned from a Hungarian engineer named Urban, has been firing at the walls for nearly 2 months, and the impacts are visible. Sections of the outer wall have crumbled, repairs have been made with earth and timber and barrel-packed rubble, and the defenders have been patching and holding, with a determination that their numbers can barely sustain. Inside the walls, the city has about 50,000 inhabitants. It is a ghost of what it once was. At the height of the Roman and early Byzantine Empire, Constantinople held perhaps 500,000 people, a great cosmopolitan metropolis of marble forums and aqueducts and churches and trading houses, the richest city in the Western world and perhaps in the whole world. Now, after centuries of plague and civil war and the catastrophic sack of 1204 when the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade, ostensibly allies, in fact enemies, tore the city apart and occupied it for 60 years, Constantinople is a city of empty spaces. There are neighborhoods that have returned to farmland within the walls, plots where goats graze between the ruins of old churches, overgrown gardens hiding the mosaic floors of former palaces. The population is concentrated in a few residential and commercial quarters, and the great civic spaces of antiquity have the melancholy grandeur of things that were built for more people than now exist to use them. But there is still Hagia Sophia. The great church, the Church of Holy Wisdom, built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century and completed in a mere 5 years by 10,000 workers through what contemporaries regarded as nothing short of miraculous, is still there, still standing, still magnificent beyond any other building in the Christian world. Its dome, which rises more than 50 meters above the nave floor, still floats in its impossible way, the ring of windows around its base creating the illusion that the dome is held up by light alone rather than by the extraordinary engineering of pendentives and semidomes that the architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus devised. The mosaics still cover the interior with their field of gold tesserae, gold that catches every candle flame and every ray of light and multiplies it, fills the space with warm reflected luminosity so that being inside Hagia Sophia is being inside light itself. On this last evening of Byzantine Constantinople, the church is filling up. The decision had been made, by whom exactly is lost to the record, but almost certainly in concert between the Emperor Constantine XI and the clergy, to hold a final liturgy. Not a private mass but a great public service, open to all, in the largest church in the city. Word had gone through the streets in the afternoon. People had put down their tools and their weapons and their cooking pots and come. They came in silence, mostly, moving through the narrow streets in the soft May evening light, past the abandoned palaces and the overgrown lots and the churches that had been closed for lack of congregations, toward the great church at the center of the city. Men who had spent the day patching the walls and carrying stones and trimming arrows came still dusty and tired. Women came with children on their hips. Old men and old women who had lived their whole lives within the city walls and could not imagine being anywhere else came slowly, leaning on sticks. The Latin Christians in the city, the Venetian and Genoese merchants and the mercenary soldiers who had come to help defend the city, came too, despite the bitter religious dispute that had divided the Latin West from the Greek Orthodox East for 4 centuries. On this night, in this church, the dispute was set aside. They knelt on the same marble floor. They looked up at the same golden dome. What they asked for may have been the same thing, phrased in different languages and different liturgical traditions, but amounting to the same prayer: Lord, let morning not come. Lord, give us one more day. Constantine himself was there. The last emperor of Byzantium, the 93rd in a line that stretched back through more than 11 centuries to Constantine the Great, who had founded the city and given it his name, was in the church that night. He is a figure we know surprisingly little about as a man. Most of what survives are the formal records of his official acts and the accounts of the siege, rather than personal recollections. But the sources that do describe him in this final period, the Venetian Niccolo Barbaro, who kept a diary through the siege, the Greek Georgios Francis, who was his personal secretary and close friend, suggest a man of genuine dignity and genuine despair in equal measure. He had spent months begging the courts of Western Europe for the aid that never came. He had written to the Pope and to Venice and to Aragon and to Hungary and received sympathetic letters and eventually nothing. He knew what the morning was likely to bring. After the liturgy, Constantine went to each person in the church and asked forgiveness for any wrong he had ever done them. He embraced his nobles and his officers. He wept, and they wept. The sources describe the church full of lamentation, not hysterical grief but a deep, quiet, collective sorrow, the kind of grief that comes when you have had enough time to understand what is being lost. Then he went to his horse and rode to the walls for the last time. The night outside was cool and clear. The Ottoman campfires stretched across the plain in their thousands, and the sound from that direction was the sound of a vast military force preparing itself, drums and horns and the movement of men and horses, a continuous low thunder that had been the soundtrack of the siege and would reach its crescendo before dawn. The defenders on the wall stood in small groups at their posts, as they had stood for 53 nights. Most of them were exhausted in the particular way that comes from weeks of inadequate sleep and constant tension, a state in which the body and mind feel slightly translucent, slightly unreal, the senses both dulled and oddly heightened at the same time. Constantine rode along the Theodosian walls in the darkness. The sources say he did this, rode the full length of the defensive lines, seeing his people, speaking brief words to the commanders at each post. The Venetian Bailo Girolamo Minotto at the Blachini section. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, who had been one of the most effective defenders of the siege, a professional soldier of great skill and personal courage, who had a wound from earlier in the campaign that had not fully healed. The Greek nobleman Lucas Notaras at the sea walls. The Catalan soldiers from the mercenary company at their section. Each of them standing in the torchlight on the walls that had been old when their grandfathers were young. Giustiniani had an exchange with the emperor that different sources record differently, but in most versions he says something like, "If God wishes to save the city, it will be saved, and if not, not." This is soldier's fatalism, but it also has the quality of a man who has done everything in his power and has come to a kind of peace with the limits of human effort. He would be wounded badly in the morning's assault, wound so seriously that he would have to be carried from the walls, and the sight of him being carried out would break the morale of the sector he commanded, and the walls would be breached. But on this last night he was still there, still whole. The night passed. The bells of the remaining churches rang the hours in the darkness. On the walls, men said their prayers or did not. Some slept in brief, exhausted intervals against the stone. The campfires on the plain burned steadily. The great cannon, the basilica, was silent. It had been firing for nearly 2 months and needed to rest its crew and cool its barrel. In the silence, the city could almost be heard breathing. What were the people inside the houses doing? The ones who were not soldiers, the women and children and old people and the clergy who could not fight? We can imagine them gathered in the inner rooms of their houses, away from the windows that faced the walls, children pulled close, icons set up on improvised altars, candles burning before the faces of saints who looked back with the gold-eyed serenity of Byzantine mosaic. Doing what people in extremity have always done, holding each other. Telling children they would be all right. Perhaps believing it. Not believing it. Waiting. The assault came an hour and a half before dawn. The initial attacks were by the irregular Bashabazouk troops, then the Anatolian regulars, then finally the elite Janissaries, Mehmed's finest soldiers, highly trained, well-equipped, and fresh, having been held back through the first waves. The walls were struck in multiple places simultaneously. In the darkness and the noise and the confusion, a small postern gate, the Kirkaporta, which had been left unlocked by some oversight or accident, was found by Ottoman soldiers who poured through it. The cry went up that the Turks were inside the walls. At that moment, something broke. Not in a dramatic military sense, there was fierce fighting in the streets for hours yet. But the weight of 53 days, the accumulated exhaustion and grief, the sight of soldiers coming through from behind when you were facing them from the front, something in the collective will of the defense gave way. People began to run. Not all of them, and not all at once, but enough. Constantine XI was last seen on foot in the streets near the Adrianople gate, having lost his horse, fighting with 2 companions. He asked that someone kill him, according to one source. The fighting continued around him and he disappeared into it. His body was never conclusively identified. The Emperor of Byzantium, the last in a line that reached back to Augustus Caesar, died anonymous in the streets of the city his dynasty had defended for 11 centuries, and we do not know his precise end. By mid-morning it was over. The soldiers streamed through the open gates. The looting of the city lasted 3 days, as was the Ottoman custom, 3 days of plunder before the Sultan entered and order was restored. The great churches were sacked, their relics taken, their precious metalwork stripped. Hagia Sophia, which had stood since 537 and had been a church for 916 years, was converted to a mosque. The carpets were laid over the marble floors. The mosaics were plastered over, some of them, the golden faces of Christ and the Virgin and the saints disappearing under a layer of white lime. Mehmed II entered the city on the afternoon of May the 29th. He was 21 years old. He went first to Hagia Sophia and stood inside the great church in the afternoon light that fell through those high windows and made the golden ceiling glow. According to the Turkish sources, he leaned down and picked up a handful of soil from the floor and poured it over his turban, an act of humility before God, a reminder that even the greatest conquest belongs ultimately to something beyond the conqueror. Whether this happened exactly as described we cannot know. But Mehmed was, by all accounts, a man of genuine culture and genuine piety and genuine ambition in equal measure, and the gesture, if he made it, was exactly the right one. The Byzantine Empire was over. It had lasted 1,123 years from the founding of Constantinople to the morning of May the 29th, 1453. No other political entity in the history of the Western world has come close to that duration. It had preserved Greek learning through the centuries when the West had forgotten it, and the Byzantine scholars who fled west in the decades before and after the fall would help ignite the Italian Renaissance. It had maintained a civilization of extraordinary artistic achievement, those golden mosaics, that theology of light, that architectural tradition of the dome, across a span of time so long that the mind can barely encompass it. Close your eyes now and let Constantinople rest. The last candles have gone out in Hagia Sophia. The night is very quiet, with the particular quiet that comes after great events, when the world has changed and has not yet understood what it has become. The Bosphorus is moving in the darkness, as it always has and always will, carrying its cold current from the Black Sea to the Marmara, indifferent to empire, indifferent to loss, flowing on. Let it carry you gently now toward sleep. The city is dreaming. The city is at peace. The golden dome is still there, still holding the light, still floating on its ring of windows above the sleeping world. Come with me now to the oldest city in the world. Come south and east, past the mountains and the high plateaus, down through the foothills where the first villages appeared 10,000 years ago, down onto the great flat plain between the rivers, the Tigris to the east, the Euphrates to the west, a plain so flat that you can see the curvature of the earth on a clear day, so fertile that early farmers who arrived here from the surrounding hills must have felt they had found the world's garden. We are going to Babylon. We are going to the most famous city of the ancient world, the city that sat at the center of civilization for 2,000 years, the city whose name became a word for magnificence and also for ruin. Babylon sits on the Euphrates, roughly where the modern city of Al-Hilla stands in Iraq. The river here moves with the calm authority of something that has been going a very long time, wide, brown with the silt it carries from the mountains of eastern Turkey, moving steadily through the flat land, its banks lined with date palms that wave their feather-dusted tops in the hot wind that comes off the desert to the west. The date palm is the tree of Mesopotamia in the same way the olive tree is the tree of the Mediterranean. It provides everything. Dates to eat, fresh and dried and processed into syrup. Palm wine. Palm fiber for rope. Palm wood for construction. The fronds for roofing and shade. The palm appears in Babylonian art and architecture constantly, its spiral symmetry abstracted into the palmette motif that runs through the carved borders of the great stone reliefs and the enameled brick friezes of the palaces and temples. The Babylon we know best, the city of the glazed blue Ishtar Gate and the hanging gardens and the great ziggurat Etemenanke, is the city of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, particularly the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 BCE. This is the Babylon of the Bible, the city to which Nebuchadnezzar brought the Jews after the destruction of Jerusalem in 587, the city of the exile. It is also the city of one of history's great building programs. Nebuchadnezzar spent decades and enormous resources expanding and beautifying Babylon, building palaces and temples and walls on a scale that left ancient visitors speechless. Let us approach the city as a traveler in Nebuchadnezzar's time would have approached it. You have been traveling for days across the flat Mesopotamian plain, through a landscape of irrigation channels and barley fields and date groves and occasional small mud brick villages. The land is very flat and the sky is very large, a sky that in summer is bleached white with heat and in winter goes deep cobalt blue in the cold dry air. You have been following the road, a proper raised road surfaced with fired brick that leads straight from the north, and for the last several hours you have been able to see, in the distance, something rising above the flat horizon, the ziggurat. Etemenanke, its Akkadian name means something like House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, was the great temple tower of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. It rose in 7 tiers from a base of nearly 90 meters square, each tier slightly smaller than the one below, finished in glazed brick of different colors for each level, the whole thing rising to a height that ancient sources put at around 90 meters, roughly the height of a modern 30-story building. At the summit was the Temple of Marduk, where his golden statue resided and where only the highest priests were admitted. From the plain, the ziggurat was visible from many kilometers away, a stepped pyramid of color rising from the flat earth, the summit sometimes hidden in cloud or haze, seeming to float in the sky. As you drew closer, other things came into view, the great double walls of the city, wide enough that a chariot could be driven along the top of them, stretching for kilometers in both directions. The outer wall alone is estimated to have been about 18 kilometers in circumference. Behind them, the tops of the city's buildings, the flat rooftops of the residential quarters, the palace complex, the columned halls of the temple precincts. And then, approaching from the north along the processional way, the broad ceremonial boulevard that ran through the center of the city, the Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate is the single most beautiful object that the ancient Near East produced, and I am not sure that is an exaggeration. The gate is now largely reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, the original glazed bricks excavated and reassembled, and standing before it, 12 meters high, the deep blue of lapis lazuli, row upon row of golden dragons and striding lions set into the blue ground, the modeled animals three-dimensional and proud and full of life. You understand immediately what Nebuchadnezzar was trying to say with the city he built. He was trying to make heaven on earth. He was trying to build a place so grand and so beautiful that the gods would be comfortable living in it. The blue of the Ishtar Gate is a very specific blue, the blue of the glaze on the fired bricks, a copper-based compound that fired in the kiln to this extraordinary deep blue-green that is richer than turquoise and deeper than cobalt. The Babylonians used this color deliberately and everywhere, on the gates, on the throne room facades, on the walls of the processional way. It was expensive and technically demanding to produce, and its use was therefore a statement of wealth and divine favor. To walk through the Ishtar Gate was to walk through a wall of divine blue into the sacred heart of the city. The processional way beyond the gate was lined with enameled brick friezes of lions, the symbol of the goddess Ishtar, walking in proud procession on both sides, so that you walked between rows of golden lions on lapis blue, the road surfaced with white limestone paving blocks, smooth and cool underfoot. The smell of the city was complex, the river, always present in any wind direction, the date palms, the cooking fires of 10,000 households, incense from the temple precincts, the particular baked earth smell of mud brick warming in the sun. It was a smell of ancient human density, of a civilization that had been here for so long that the city itself had become a kind of geology. Let us go into the city now, away from the grand ceremonial axis, into the residential quarters where ordinary Babylonians lived. The houses were mud brick, as almost everything in Mesopotamia was. Stone was rare on the flat alluvial plain and had to be imported at great expense, so it was reserved for the most important buildings and objects. Mud brick, however, was excellent building material in a dry climate, well insulated against both heat and cold, easy to repair, cheap. A Babylonian house of the middling sort was built around a central courtyard, which provided light and air to the rooms surrounding it. The rooms were few and multipurpose. The family cooked, ate, slept, and worked in the same spaces, furniture minimal by our standards, the floors covered with reed mats and perhaps a rug or two in the wealthier households. The Babylonian family kept their gods close. Each household had its own protective deities, small clay figurines of divine beings placed in niches in the walls or under the threshold of the house door, where they could guard the family in their coming and going. The great gods of the Babylonian pantheon, Marduk the chief god, Ishtar the goddess of love and war, Nabu the god of writing and wisdom, Shamash the sun god, Sin the moon god, were present in the temples and in the official ceremonies, but they were also present in the domestic life of the city through these household shrines and through the family rituals that accompanied every significant event: birth, marriage, illness, death. The Babylonians were extraordinarily literate, and they wrote everything down on clay. The cuneiform script, wedge-shaped impressions made in wet clay with a reed stylus, the clay then dried or fired, had been invented in southern Mesopotamia around 3300 BCE, making it one of the oldest writing systems in the world. By Nebuchadnezzar's time it had been in use for nearly 3,000 years. In the palace archives and temple libraries and private houses of Babylon, tens of thousands of clay tablets recorded business contracts and property deeds and marriage agreements and debt records and astronomical observations and medical recipes and myths and hymns and royal inscriptions and letters between individuals. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are the world's first archives, and they have survived better than papyrus or parchment because clay, once fired, is essentially indestructible. We have more written records from ancient Mesopotamia than from ancient Egypt or Greece. Let us walk through the market quarter in the late afternoon. The great bazaar area near the river was where the commerce of the empire concentrated. Merchants from every direction of the compass brought their goods here: a lapis lazuli and carnelian from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, cedar wood from Lebanon, grain and wool from the Anatolian plateau, fine cloth from Egypt, dates and barley and sesame oil from the surrounding farmland, fish from the Euphrates and the Gulf. The market was loud and colorful and fragrant, the smell of spices and dried fruit and raw wool and fish and the river mud that clung to the sailors' feet. The date was the fundamental food of Mesopotamia. Eaten fresh from the tree in late summer, they were sweet and soft, the juice running down the chin. Dried, they kept for months and traveled well, providing dense energy for travelers and soldiers. Pressed into syrup, date honey, they called it, they provided a sweetener used in cooking and in the fermentation of date wine, which was the universal drink of the region, consumed at every social level from the humblest laborer to the king. There is a Babylonian proverb, "Do not eat dates from a tree you did not plant." It is the kind of proverb that feels ancient not because it is wise but because it is so specific, so rooted in the actual texture of a life where the date tree was both food and property and marker of your place in the world. Now let us speak of the hanging gardens, though with the necessary honesty that this subject demands. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, listed by ancient Greek and Roman writers as among the greatest marvels of the human-made world. The ancient sources describe them as a series of terraced gardens, watered by some ingenious mechanical system that drew water up from the Euphrates to the highest terrace and let it cascade down, so that the gardens appeared to float above the city, green and impossible in the dry heat of the Mesopotamian plain. They were said to have been built by Nebuchadnezzar for his Median wife Amytes, who missed the green hills and forests of her homeland. The problem is that no definitively identified physical remains of the gardens have been found in Babylon. No Babylonian text from the period, and we have many Babylonian texts, mentions the Hanging Gardens. This silence has led some scholars to suggest that the gardens may have been in Nineveh rather than Babylon, built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, and the attribution to Babylon may be a later confusion. Others argue that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, that perishable gardens might leave little trace, that our excavations of Babylon are incomplete. Whether the Hanging Gardens were in Babylon or Nineveh or only in the imagination of later centuries, the dream of them is entirely Mesopotamian. In a landscape of dust and sky and mud and river, the idea of green terraces rising cool and flower-fragrant above the city, watered by the ingenuity of the engineer, is exactly the Babylonian dream. A dream of ordering nature, of turning the desert into a garden by human intelligence and will, which is, after all, exactly what the irrigation civilization of Mesopotamia did, on the grand scale, for 3,000 years. Let us end our evening in Babylon on a rooftop. The Babylonian rooftop was a living space, particularly in the hot summers when the interior of the house was stifling. People slept on rooftops, cooked on rooftops, socialized on rooftops. From a rooftop in the center of the city you could see across the flat expanse of other rooftops to the great monuments, the blue gleam of the Ishtar Gate in the distance, the tiers of Etemenanke rising against the darkening sky. The cooking fires of neighboring households were beginning to glow in the dusk. The smell of dinner, a barley bread, lentil stew, roasting fish from the river, drifted on the cooling air. And above it all, the sky. The Mesopotamian sky at night is extraordinary. The flat landscape and the dry desert air combined to produce a darkness uncontaminated by any light source, in which the Milky Way was a solid river of brightness overhead and the planets moved with a precision that the Babylonian astronomers had been tracking for centuries. The Babylonians were among the most sophisticated astronomers of the ancient world. They could predict solar eclipses, they had developed a mathematical system of calculations for planetary motion, they had named the constellations and passed their names on through the Greeks to us. The stars above Babylon were their data, their divine messages, their calendar, and their compass. Every night, from the high terrace of the ziggurat, the astronomer priests watched the sky and recorded what they saw on clay tablets that have survived. The stars are the same stars. The Euphrates is still there, moving with the same brown patience through the same flat plain, though it carries less water now than it did in Nebuchadnezzar's time and the date palms are fewer. The ruins of the Ishtar Gate's original foundations are there in the earth, the glazed tiles that were not taken to Berlin still embedded in the soil. The mounds that are the buried palaces and temples of Babylon rise gently from the plain, looking from a distance like natural hills, keeping their secrets under the Iraqi sky. Let the river carry you now. Let the date palms move in the evening wind and the stars come out one by one over the ziggurat. The city is settling into the night, the cooking fires burning low, the rooftop sleepers wrapping themselves in linen against the night air that is cool after the scorching day. The scribe has sealed his clay tablet. The astronomer on the high terrace is watching the moon rise over the eastern horizon, bone-white and enormous. The city breathes. The city has been breathing for 4,000 years and will breathe for 4,000 more. Sleep now, on the rooftop under the stars, with the river just audible in the dark below. Let your breath slow a little more. We are traveling east now, far east, following the Silk Roads across the great deserts and mountain ranges, across the grass sea of Central Asia, through the mountain passes into the most populated country on earth, down to the great northern plain where the Yellow River bends and the mountains stand blue at the horizon. We are going to Beijing. We are going to the center of the world, as the Ming emperors understood it, the Forbidden City. And we are going there at night, when the gates are closed and the vast complex settles into silence and the lanterns glow against the red walls. The Forbidden City was built between 1406 and 1420 under the Yongle Emperor of the Ming dynasty, a man of immense energy and ambition who moved the capital from Nanjing in the south to Beijing in the north and built, in the space of 14 years, the largest palace complex in the world. It remains the largest today. The Forbidden City contains 980 buildings, covering 72 hectares, surrounded by a wall 10 meters high and a moat 52 meters wide. Everything about it was designed to convey one message with overwhelming physical force: the Emperor of China is the Son of Heaven, the mediator between the divine order and the human world, the pivot on which everything turns. The name, the Forbidden City, Zijin Cheng in Chinese, meaning Purple Forbidden City, comes from the Chinese astronomical tradition in which the North Star and the stars surrounding it were called the Purple Forbidden Enclosure, the celestial home of the supreme divinity, from which the universe was governed. The earthly palace was designed as a mirror of this celestial precinct, positioned precisely on the north-south axis that also ran through the Temple of Heaven to the south and the Drum Tower to the north. Everything was aligned. Everything expressed the orderly relationship between heaven and earth that it was the emperor's sacred duty to maintain. To approach the Forbidden City from the south, as visitors were intended to approach, was to experience a sequence of ever larger spaces and ever grander gateways that built toward a climax of scale almost impossible to prepare for. The approach began at Tiananmen, the Gate of Heavenly Peace, which even today, stripped of its dynastic context, is an enormous structure that dwarfs the human standing before it. Beyond Tiananmen, a forecourt. Then the Meridian Gate, the formal entrance to the palace complex proper, its 5 arched passages, the central one reserved for the emperor alone, flanked by great drum towers. Beyond the Meridian Gate, the vast outer courtyard and the stream of the Golden Water River, crossed by 5 white marble bridges. And then the Gate of Supreme Harmony, and beyond it, the outer court, and in the center of the outer court, the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The Hall of Supreme Harmony was the largest wooden building in China and is still, after 600 years, one of the largest wooden buildings in the world. It sits on a triple-tiered white marble terrace that elevates it above the courtyard, the 3 levels of carved marble balustrades and staircases multiplying its visual authority. The roof is the characteristic Ming Palace roof, double-eaved, the deep golden tiles curving up at the corners in the way that is simultaneously architectural and sculptural and that references, in its upward curve, the movement of dragon tails and phoenixes in flight. On the roof's ridges and at the corners of the eaves are small ceramic figures, the so-called roof guardians, a rider on a phoenix followed by a line of mythological animals in descending order of rank, which served as both protective talismans and indicators of the building's imperial importance, since only the most important structures were allowed the full complement of figures. Inside the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Dragon Throne. The throne itself was carved from wood and lacquered in imperial yellow and decorated with golden dragons, the dragon being the symbol of the emperor, benevolent and powerful, lord of water and clouds, and elevated on a dais at the far end of the hall. The hall is so large that on official ceremonial occasions, the officials kowtowing before the throne could barely see the emperor at the far end. They were in the presence of an idea as much as a person. The Son of Heaven, at sufficient remove, became not quite human. But we are here at night, and the great ceremonies are not happening. The hall is empty, or nearly empty. Let us move deeper into the complex, through the succession of gates and courtyards that separate the outer ceremonial areas from the inner residential quarters, the part of the Forbidden City that tourists today reach only after a long walk through the outer courts, the part where the actual life of the imperial family took place. The inner court was a world within a world within a world. Here lived the emperor, his empress, his consorts, his mother, his children, and the thousands of servants, ladies in waiting, and eunuchs who supported this domestic life. The eunuchs of the Ming imperial palace deserve a moment of attention, because they were one of the most unusual and powerful institutions in Chinese history. By the mid-Ming period, the palace eunuch population numbered in the thousands, some estimates put it at around 70,000 at peak, though this almost certainly counts the broader imperial service and not just the Forbidden City itself. They occupied every level of palace service, from the most menial kitchen tasks to positions of enormous political power as trusted intermediaries between the emperor and the outside world. The eunuchs were the only adult males allowed to live within the inner palace, since only they could be trusted with the virtue of the imperial women. They occupied an in-between status, neither fully male nor female in the society's understanding, neither quite commoner nor official, belonging to the palace in a way that excluded them from ordinary life. Many had entered imperial service as boys from poor families who saw in the sacrifice a path to security and influence. The most powerful eunuchs, like the infamous Wei Zhongxian in the early 17th century, could wield authority that eclipsed that of the highest-ranked officials. The least powerful carried trays of food and stood motionless at doorways for hours and lived in small rooms in the complex's service courtyards and knew the palace with the intimate knowledge of those who spend their whole lives in one place. The palace at night belonged to the eunuchs and the ladies in waiting. The ladies in waiting were mostly young women from respectable families, selected for their education and personal qualities to serve the empress and the imperial consorts. They managed the inner palace household, the food, the clothing, the children's education, the religious observances, the 1,000 daily practical details of palace life. Their world was almost entirely contained within the Forbidden City's red walls. Permission to leave was rare and governed by strict protocol. Some spent decades within the walls, their connection to the outside world maintained only through family visits and the letters they were permitted to send and receive. Let us walk through the inner palace now, in the quietest hour before dawn. The lanterns hanging at the corridor eaves are still lit, red silk lanterns that cast a warm, slightly reddish light on the red-painted walls and the stone-paved passages and the ornamental plants in their ceramic pots. The night is cool. This is October, in the long period of the Xuande Emperor's reign, one of the most admired of all the Ming emperors, a man known for his personal culture. He painted bamboo and crickets with genuine skill, and his relatively benign and stable governance. The emperor himself has retired. He sleeps in the Palace of Heavenly Purity, the principal residential palace of the inner court, on a bed of carved and lacquered wood under quilts of silk padded with goose down, in a room where the charcoal-heated floor creates a warmth that is constant regardless of the season. His sleep is guarded by eunuchs stationed just outside the door. Tomorrow there will be court audiences and memorials to review and decisions to be made, the endless administration of an empire of 60 million people, but tonight there is only the warm dark and the silence. Walk with me now into the Imperial Garden. The Garden of Imperial Tranquility, at the northern end of the inner court, was created in the early Ming and has changed little in 600 years. The same ancient cypresses stand in it today, gnarled and enormous, their trunks deeply furrowed and their crowns spreading wide above ornamental rocks of Taihu limestone. Those strange porous stones whose surfaces have been hollowed by water into shapes that the Chinese aesthetic considered beautiful precisely for their asymmetry and unpredictability. The garden is small by the standards of later Chinese imperial gardens, and it is intentionally compressed. Everything in it is dense and layered, the space made to feel much larger than it is through the arrangement of pavilions and water and rocks and plants. At this hour, the garden is in moonlight. The white marble paving of the main path reflects the moon. The surface of the ornamental pool is perfectly still, and in it the reflection of the pavilion lanterns wobbles very gently in the microscopic air movement that is the only wind at this hour. The cypresses are dark shapes against the moon-pale sky. An old cat. The Forbidden City has always had cats, kept to control the rat population in the grain stores and kitchens, and some of them have lived here so long they seem to belong to the architecture, sits motionless on a garden rock, watching something in the shadows with the focused patience of cats everywhere. From somewhere in the inner palace complex, faint and almost inaudible, the sound of a guqin. The guqin is the seven-stringed zither of Chinese literati culture, an instrument so old that Confucius is said to have played it and whose music was considered the highest expression of personal cultivation. Its sound is quiet by nature. It was never meant to fill large spaces but to be heard in intimate rooms, to be played alone or for one or two listeners, the music a kind of thinking out loud in sound. The strings are plucked and pressed, the left hand sliding along the silk strings to create the characteristic gliding tones, and the music moves slowly, with long silences between phrases that are themselves considered part of the composition. Someone in the palace is playing the guqin in the early hours of the morning. A court lady who cannot sleep. A eunuch musician practicing. Perhaps the emperor himself, the Xuande emperor, was known to play. The music moves through the stone corridors and out into the garden, quiet and very pure in the cold air, and then falls silent between phrases, and in those silences the whole palace is still. The Ming dynasty would last until 1644, when the last emperor, Chengzhen, hanged himself on Coal Hill, the Jingshan Hill just north of the Forbidden City, as rebel forces entered Beijing. He had cut off his daughter's arm to spare her from capture, and written a final edict in his own blood on his robe. The dynasty that had built the Forbidden City, that had sent Jing his great fleets across the Indian Ocean, that had repaired and extended the Great Wall, that had governed the most populous nation on earth for nearly 3 centuries, came to its end there on the hillside under the old pines, the imperial city empty and burning below. But that is not tonight. Tonight the dynasty is in its middle years, prosperous and stable, the red walls still gleaming with fresh paint, the golden tiles still bright, the lanterns lit in every corridor of the vast palace. The cat is still on its rock in the garden. The guqin is still playing, somewhere in the depth of the complex, the notes drifting out into the cold moonlit air and dissolving into silence and beginning again. Let that sound carry you now, slowly, note by long note, into the warmth of sleep. The Forbidden City is keeping its watch. The great gates are closed. Nothing outside can enter. Nothing inside will be lost tonight. You are inside the walls, inside the warmth, inside the light. Sleep now. The guqin is playing. The lanterns are burning. The garden is very still. Come back west now, back across the continent, across the Channel, up the broad brown Thames into the green heart of England. It is late summer, and the countryside on either side of the river is the impossible deep green of an English summer after rain, the hedgerows heavy and dark, the water meadows thick with rushes and the cry of herons, the willows trailing their hair in the current. We are heading upriver from London, leaving behind the city smell of coal smoke and river mud and the noise of the docks, moving through the clean country air with the water sounds around us and the oars dipping and the current running easy under the hull. We are going to Hampton Court. We are going to the largest and most magnificent royal palace in England, and we are going there in the year 1535, at the height of the reign of Henry VIII. Hampton Court was not originally a royal palace. It was built and developed by Thomas Wolsey, the Cardinal Archbishop of York, who served Henry as Lord Chancellor and was the second most powerful man in England for nearly 2 decades. Wolsey understood power and its expressions with the precision of a man who had risen from the son of a butcher in Ipswich to the height of the church and the state on nothing but intelligence and ambition and an extraordinary capacity for work. He built Hampton Court to be the finest private residence in England, which was, given Wolsey's position, a way of saying the finest residence in England full stop, since the king's own palaces were at that moment less grand. When Henry finally grew tired of Wolsey's overreaching and stripped him of everything, his offices, his property, ultimately his freedom, Hampton Court passed to the Crown, and Henry made it his own. Henry came to Hampton Court as often as he could. The palace sat on the Thames about 12 miles upstream from London, in the kind of location that combined convenience with escape, close enough to Westminster that business could still be conducted, far enough that it felt genuinely removed from the city. The grounds were extensive: gardens, orchards, a hunting park, a tilt yard for jousting, tennis courts, a bowling green. Hampton Court was a full-service environment for the Tudor idea of kingship, which combined the ceremonial with the athletic with the cultural in a way that was entirely characteristic of Henry himself. Henry VIII at his best, and there was a best, for all that his later life gave us reasons to remember him primarily for the worst, was one of the most Renaissance figures the English court ever produced. He was extraordinarily well educated. He read Latin and French and Spanish. He had studied theology deeply enough to write a treatise defending the 7 sacraments against Luther, which earned him the title Defender of the Faith from a grateful pope, a title that the English monarchs continue to use today. in one of history's richer ironies. He was an accomplished composer. The familiar piece Greensleeves is probably not his, but he definitely wrote other songs, including settings of religious texts. He played the lute and the virginals and the flute. He was an excellent jouster and tennis player in his youth, a genuinely skilled athlete in a court that valued athleticism as a sign of noble character. Let us arrive at Hampton Court by water, which was the preferred method for royalty and the nobility travelling between London and the riverside palaces. The royal barge was a magnificent vessel, long, covered amidships with a crimson silk awning fringed in gold, its hull painted in Tudor colours of green and white, rowed by oarsmen in royal livery. The journey from Westminster took a few hours, following the river through the increasingly green and peaceful landscape, past Kew and Richmond and Twickenham, the city dissolving behind and the countryside taking over, the river widening and quieting, Heron standing motionless in the reeds as the barge passed. Arrival at Hampton Court by river was through the Privy Stairs, a private landing stage below the garden wall. As the barge came in, the palace rose above the water, an immense structure of red brick, the material so characteristic of late medieval English architecture that it seems almost definitionally Tudor. The brickwork of Hampton Court is beautiful in the way that only handmade things are beautiful, each brick slightly different from its neighbors in color and surface texture, the whole wall having a warmth and variation that machine-made brick never achieves. The chimneys are among the building's most famous features, enormous decorated chimneys in many different styles, each unique, rising from the roofline in a statement of extravagance since every chimney implied a fireplace and every fireplace implied a heated room. And heated rooms in a damp English climate were a luxury that only the wealthy could sustain in large numbers. Let us go inside, past the outer courtyards and the base court and clock court, past the great astronomical clock on the gateway tower that tells not only the time but the month, the day, the phase of the moon, the position of the sun in the zodiac, and the time of high tide at London Bridge. The clock is one of the most extraordinary objects at Hampton Court and gives you something of the Tudor intellectual character, the desire to comprehend and display the whole order of things in one magnificent instrument, to have heaven's movements visible on the wall of the courtyard so that every time you pass beneath it you were reminded of your place in the cosmic order. Through to the Great Hall. Henry rebuilt and enlarged the Great Hall at Hampton Court, and it is one of the finest examples of Tudor Great Hall architecture still standing. The hall is large, 32 meters long, 12 meters wide, and its ceiling is a hammer-beam roof of carved oak, the beams elaborately decorated with pendants and heraldic symbols, the bays between the beams filled with tapestried walls. The tapestries are extraordinary objects in themselves, enormous woven panels depicting the story of Abraham, commissioned by Henry around 1540, their wool and silk thread still vivid after nearly 500 years, the figures in them wearing a strange mixture of biblical and Tudor dress, as was conventional in the period, so that Abraham and his household look simultaneously ancient and contemporary with Henry's court. The hall served as the principal dining room for the hundreds of members of the court who were not senior enough to eat with the king in his private rooms. It was fed by the great kitchen, one of the most remarkable spaces in Hampton Court, a complex of multiple rooms and hearths and cooking stations capable of producing meals for 500 people at a time, with a staff of hundreds of cooks, scullions, wood carriers, and serving staff organized into a hierarchy as elaborate as the court itself. The sheer scale of Tudor royal catering was staggering. The household accounts record thousands of animals consumed annually, thousands of gallons of wine, thousands of gallons of ale, quantities of spices and sugar and dried fruit that traveled from the Mediterranean and beyond to end up in the sauces of an English court. A feast at Hampton Court began in the late afternoon and could last well into the night. The food came in processions of covered dishes carried from the kitchen through the serving passages to the hall or to the king's private apartments, each dish uncovered with ceremony before being placed on the table. The range of courses was extreme by modern standards. There might be 20 or 30 separate dishes at a great feast, moving from roasted meats to baked fish to elaborate pastry constructions called subtleties, which were sculptures in sugar paste depicting scenes of mythology or heraldry and were as much theatrical objects as food. The spices that flavored everything, the ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, were not just flavoring but were themselves a statement of wealth, since spices traveled from the far side of the world and their price reflected that journey. The music at Hampton Court was constant and expert. Henry maintained a chapel royal, a body of professional musicians and singers who performed the liturgical music for daily services, and a corps of secular musicians for entertainment. Tudor court music ranged from the complex polyphony of the chapel royal choristers, whose elaborate interweaving vocal lines filled the chapel royal's fan-vaulted spaces with sound of extraordinary richness, to the lighter dance music of the consort musicians who played at feasts and entertainments. The consort instruments, lutes, viols, recorders, virginals, had a particular quality of sound that was lighter and more translucent than the big-bodied instruments of later periods, the music moving easily through large rooms without overwhelming them. Henry himself sometimes played at these entertainments. Contemporary accounts describe him picking up a lute or sitting at the virginals with no apparent self-consciousness, joining the professional musicians for informal music-making with the ease of a man who considered musical ability a natural part of being a cultivated person rather than an exceptional talent. The court culture he presided over treated the arts as expressions of nobility. A courtier who could not dance, could not compose a passable lyric, could not accompany himself on the lute, was considered incomplete. Sir Thomas Eliot's Book of the Governor, published in 1531, laid out the ideal education for a Tudor gentleman, and music featured prominently, along with dancing and languages and classical learning. The Thames outside Hampton Court was the setting for some of the most theatrical of Tudor entertainments, the water pageants, elaborate performances staged on barges and on the river itself, with costumed figures representing classical gods and mythological episodes, fireships and artificial islands, and spectacular lighting effects produced with torches and colored fires. These water pageants were among the most expensive single entertainments the Tudor court mounted, and their purpose was simultaneously aesthetic and political, to display the magnificence of the royal court to the watching crowds on both banks and to assert, through the cultural vocabulary of classical mythology and Renaissance allegory, the civilized grandeur of the English monarchy. But the river also served simpler pleasures. Henry liked to fish. He liked to row himself, sometimes, in a small boat without ceremony, with only a few companions. The Thames at this point is broad and brown and moves with a steady unhurried purpose, and in the early morning, before the day's business began, it would have been possible to sit in a small boat in the middle of the river and hear nothing but the water and the birds and feel, briefly, very far from the complicated machinery of a royal court. That is where we will rest tonight. On the water, in the quiet hour before the palace wakes, the mist lying on the surface of the Thames in long ribbons, the red brick of Hampton Court warm even in the grey morning light, a heron standing motionless in the shallows, absolutely still except for the occasional slow blink of its ancient eye. The swans are moving upriver, stately and indifferent. A kingfisher passes low over the water like a blue-green spark and disappears into the rushes. Inside the palace, the fires have been banked for the night and are beginning to be stirred up again by the first servants of the morning, who move through the still rooms in the grey light setting out the day's necessities. The great astronomical clock on the tower shows the hour and the moon and the tide, keeping its patient record of time passing. The tapestries hang still in the hall, Abraham and his household frozen in their eternal moment of embroidered light. Let the river carry you now. Let the mist move around you in the early morning and the sound of the water fill the space where thought was. You are on the Thames in the green heart of England, and the palace is behind you warm and solid, and the morning has barely begun, and there is nowhere you need to be. Sleep now, in the mist, on the water, while the herons watch and the swans pass and the old clock marks the turning hours on its ancient face.